Welcome guys to this course on personal economics. In this first course I will give some general information about what personal economics is all about and what you can expect from this course. Okay, so this is also covered in the menu. So first a bit of general introduction, then we're going to talk about personal economics, and then I will talk a bit more about the organization of this course. Of course also about the exam, which is what you are probably most interested in. Today we're going to talk about, among others, the definitions and characteristics of personal economics. I will show how different HR practices actually come to reflect different economic logics and principles. But I will also focus on the limits of personal economics. So of course we're still HR people, we are not economists. And I will also focus on what you can expect from this course. But first a bit about me. So some of you guys already uploaded a video introducing yourselves. Thank you for that. And for those who have not found the time, please do so, as I would really like to know who I'm actually teaching to. So my name is Robin. I'm an assistant professor at this university. I mostly teach courses on methods, economics, and discussion seminars on HR. I was born in this majestic city, the Venice of the North, and of course we're not talking about Amsterdam, but Belgium. Now it's Corona time, but otherwise I would say this is only a train ride away, so please, whenever you have the opportunity to do so, visit this majestic place. But throughout my life I've also lived in Sweden. That's Malmö you can see here. This is the turning torso, which looks a bit like a human spine. And of all places, I've also lived in Wuppertal, which is in Germany. Wuppertal isn't famous for very much, but it's famous for the Schwebebahn, which is this strange monorail type of thing. And when I'm not teaching or researching, I like to cook and run, of course, not in combination. So this is you in a couple of years. You're, of course, by then, a credible activist, an expert and advocate of HR knowledge. And you come in and you say, well, guys, we should invest more in employees and hire more people. You will actually quickly notice that there's some resistance within firms towards HR. Most people in boardrooms management, they have a background in business and economics. And they will say, well, all HR does is cost money. And this is actually a typical quote that you will hear throughout your career. Problem is, they are partly right. Our observation as teachers is that graduates of HR studies or graduated master students, they are very good, credible activists. But their understanding of economic logics and contingencies could actually use some improvement. This could actually help you to deal with people with a more business background, which you will meet throughout your career. And therefore we have two courses in this people management program. The first one you already had in block 3, that's financial HR. So this deals with the financial implications of HR interventions. And this is personal economics, so it's the sister course of financial HR, and here we talk with the economic theories and principles behind typical HR decisions. But what is personal economics all about? Personal economics is about the economic theories and principles behind typical HR problems. And if this was a regular course, I would of course ask to the audience, what are typical HR problems? But now we will give the answer myself. So, typical HR problems are of course, how do we attract or select talented employees? How do we motivate them and further train and develop them? Or when do we need to redeploy them? Or even let them go, let them exit the firm. So HR problems, they all deal with the employment relationship. Economic theories and principles, on the other hand, they often deal with efficiency and effectiveness. For example, supply and demand, market equilibrium, financial constraints, rational agents. So economic theories, they all deal with efficiency and effectiveness. So personal economics is about the efficiency and effectiveness of the employment relationship, where efficiency refers to with a minimum amount of means, and effectiveness refers to with a maximum amount of output. So in this course, we will not only talk about employees' well-being, at least not in the classic sense as you know well-being, but we'll also focus on how to organize typical HR problems in a way that are efficient and effective, both for employees and organizations. In this course, we will mostly talk about economics of motivation. We will focus on the motivation of individual employees in class 2 and 3. We will talk about the motivation of employees when they are in competition for each other, for example, for promotion. For employees in a team, how motivation works there, does it work different than for individual employees? I will also focus on economics of selecting and recruiting employees and training employees. I see there is an E missing there. But as a good fairy tale begins, once upon a time, there was personal economics. And personal economics is a young discipline, but it has classic roots. It's built on the insights of, let's say, some classic economic thinkers. And this is actually an unlikely alliance we have here. So here we have Edward Lazier. Edward Lazier coined personal economics at the end of the 80s, beginning of the 90s, the man with a creepy smile. To say personal economics is to say Lazier, and we will meet him throughout this course as well. We will study an experiment of him later in this book. So he is known as the father of personal economics. But of course, Edward built on earlier insights from an unlikely duo of Carl and Adam, that is, Adam Smith and Karl Marx. Adam you might know from The Wealth of Nations, and Karl Marx you might know from the Communist Manifesto, both known as the founder of economic liberalism and communism, respectively. So indeed, an unlikely alliance of people. The cornerstone of personal economics is the separation of ownership and control, which creates, in turn, agency problems. So agency refers here to agents, so to employees. A simple illustration of this problem is the following. It's that the guy or gal who owns a place is not necessarily the one running it. So he or she has to give away a bit of control to people who are not necessarily motivated to act in, let's say, ways that would directly benefit him or her. For example, think of a small business owner. He or she might own his or her shop, but from a certain moment the business grows and he or she needs to hire someone. Now, his or her task will be to keep that person motivated to do his or her best on his or her behalf. So indeed, the business owner has to give away a bit of control and remain sure at the same time that the employee will remain motivated. And this is actually the birth of the employee relationship. But how do we do that? How do we keep this employee or this agent motivated? So basically, the agency problem. And this is a problem Lazier covered that traditional economics does not provide an adequate answer to. Some traditional answers can, however, be found in the words of Smith and Marx. Let's first head towards Smith. So Smith said to motivate employees, to solve the agency problem, first we have to do is to respect compensating differentials. This is basically a fancy word for a trade-off between wages on the one hand and non-monetary working conditions. In other words, if you have an easy job in a safe environment, say you are a government employee in Pawnee, you should earn less than where you are, let's say, a muscled worker on an oil rig. So Smith says that both wages and non-monetary working conditions, they are in perfect balance, or they're in market equilibrium in each other. So this means 1 unit of safety less should correspond to 1 unit increase in pay to satisfy the want of both employees and organizations. This equilibrium is steered by market forces, so there is no interference of government, of other actors, there's only the invisible hands. So the market, basically the employees and the organizations alone, they will find a single best solution. However, we know in practice that this compensating wage differentials, this is not always the case. Think, for example, about care professions. Care professions, like a nurse, they typically have bad conditions and also lower pay. So compensating differentials is no real answer to our agency problem, to our motivation question. Then maybe Marx is the answer. So Marx said, why do wages not always reflect monetary conditions? Simple, because labor is a commodity. Labor is an economic good, and that means it's subjected to market forces, so to supply and demand. It also means that it has a monetary exchange value. Commodities typically have an exchange value that can be expressed in money. So how does this work with labor? Let's illustrate this with the following. Imagine I give you 20 euros for 1 hour of painting my fence. Without 20 euros, you can buy 10 beers, or at least in the cheap bars or in the old days. So paying you 20 euros is actually the same as giving you 20 beers. Why? Because they have the same monetary exchange value. So actually, wage and economic goods, they are interchangeable. Allow me to read you a piece of Marx, and actually you will find that it's very engageably written and very accessible for being a 19th century author. So, now the same general laws which regulate the price of commodities in general naturally regulate wages or the price of labor power. Wages will now rise, now fall, according to the relation of supply and demand. The fluctuation of wages corresponds to the fluctuation in the price of commodities in general. So here Marx says labor power is not only a commodity subjected to market forces, but also within the limits of this fluctuation, the price of labor power will be determined by the cost of production, by the labor time necessary for production of this commodity. So he also said there are other factors that determine an employee's wage. So why does compensating differentials not work? Because labor power is subjected to market forces, and there are also other forces taken into account to determine this price. For example, the time needed to train or develop an employee for the execution of a task. Okay, you might think this offers a reason, but it's still not a full answer to the agency problem, so on how to motivate employees. And that's also what Lazier found out. Now, you may think, HR to the rescue? Well, we'll actually find out. Lazier was and is not so fond of HR either. He calls it a chatty literature. So traditional production literature provides no answers how wages should be structured to motivate employees. But HR is an institutional and somewhat chatty literature that could be replaced by more analytic work based on empirical investigation and rigorous theory. So basically, all HR does is chat without really giving empirical founded advice. So in reaction to the shortcoming of traditional economics, and also to a small extent the shortcoming of HR in answering this agency problem, Lazier suggested at the end of the 80s personal economics as a kind of a new approach. Main difference with traditional economics or traditional labor economics is that, let's say, traditional economics focuses more on the external labor market, what happens outside of organizations, and on labor supply, while personal economics happens more on what happens inside organizations, so the organization of the inside labor market. And we find that often the external labor market is governed by economic laws, while the internal labor market is more governed by administrative rules and procedures. Now, what are the characteristics of this personal economics? We'll focus on three key characteristics. So that employees and organizations are rational maximizing agents, so meaning they will act on the basis of information that is available to them. In doing so, they will want to maximize their welfare, so often their financial benefits, and then there is an assumption of market equilibrium, meaning there is a single best solution or multiple solutions in which the welfare of both employees and organizations can be perfectly satisfied. So let's first focus on the first characteristics. So employees and organizations, they are rational maximizing agents, which means they will act on the basis of information, so not on the basis of emotions or feelings. In doing so, they will make individual choices on how to act. So they will decide on their own on how to act on the basis of this information. In doing so, they will act coherently, which means if they would be posed in the same or in a similar situation, they would act in the same way. Of course, this is not the full picture. We increasingly also recognize that information that agents have access to can be imperfect. For example, the information they can have can be incorrect, or they might first need to do something to obtain information in the first place. We also recognize that there is no single best solution. As I said before, there might be multiple ways of satisfying the wants of both employees and organizations. Think of, we have a similar thing in HR, best fit versus best practice. There is no such thing as a good HR practice that fits in every context. No, what is a good HR practice depends on the context. An HR practice that is good in a chicken slaughterhouse might be entirely dysfunctional in an accountancy firm. A modern example of a rational agent is AI, because AI works basically on the processing of information. It does not act on the basis of or not yet, on the basis of feelings or emotional outputs. It purely acts on the basis of information that is available and makes choices on the basis of that. It will also act in a coherent way in doing so. So if you feed an algorithm the same information, it would act in a coherent way. Employers and organizations will want to maximize their own well-being, and that means often financial well-being. So individuals, be it organizations or employees, they want to maximize their own gains and strive for the greatest good. So they always want more in their own benefit. In philosophy, we call this being utilitarian. You might know this term from an intro course in psychology or philosophy. So the philosophy of striving for the greater good for oneself is called utilitarianism, coined by Bentham. In economics, we call this the homo economicus, so people being rational and being economic in the first place, driven by money or other tangible advantages. However, while much of economics is based on the view of the homo economicus, or rational economic man, we also realize more and more that this is a simple assumption. Employees are more homo reciprocans, so a reciprocating man. They're also driven by exchange of less tangible and less economic factors, like, for example, intrinsic motivation that he or she derives from a task, feelings of fairness, equality, and so on. So basically, we start more and more to question this basic of rational economic man, and also recognize that employees have a much more broader motivation base that goes beyond simple money and economic factors. The third assumption is market equilibrium. And this might be the most abstract assumption, but it's actually simple. So it means that there is a balance somewhere. Personal economics believes that the wants of employees and organizations, they can be satisfied at all times. You just have to find the right solution. What is this right solution? It's where the organization pays or invests what it wants, and employees also receive the gains and returns that they want. So just as economics assumes perfect markets, so that supply and demand can be in perfect balance with each other, personal economics assumes perfect internal labor markets, which the wants and needs of employees can also be in perfect balance. However, it's important to know that personal economics has some important limits. Think of the following examples. So the Swedish fika. I told you before I lived in Sweden for a time. In Sweden, it's common to have regular coffee or sweet breaks between colleagues during the hours. Now, from an economic point of view, this is useless, because this is time the organization spends on paying employees while they are not performing, so it's not rational at all. The benefits of this practice might be more social than they are financial. So personal economics has no answer to this, why fika exists in organizations. Same goes for Japanese nemawashi. So nemawashi refers to the importance of informal processes in Japan that underlie formal decision-making. So it's important in Japan to inform senior management of important decisions before official meetings can take place. Otherwise, they are likely to reject your idea or proposal straight away. So if you want to propose a reform, it's better to inform senior management like informally beforehand, because if you're going to throw this on the table in the middle of the meeting, you're likely to face rejection straight away because you have ignored the informal process that goes before the meeting. Again, from personal economics cannot explain why this happened. This is not a rational occurrence. It's neither an efficient occurrence. It's merely something cultural. It might be important to take this into account to function in this kind of settings as an employee or an organization, but yeah, it's not something that can be explained by personal economics. The third one is performance appraisal. While many organizations practice performance appraisal, so think of the yearly evaluation interview, we actually know from research that performance appraisals are useless. They do not work. It's much better to give employees continuous feedback and not restrict it to like this one stressful event. Then why do so many organizations practice performance appraisal? We can also not explain this. They just copy each other. In other words, why do some inefficient non-economic practices come into being and persist even in crisis time? And to this, personal economics has no or a limited answer. Here we need other perspectives. For example, the contextual strategic human resource model of our own Ba2. If you don't know this model, you will soon learn it. So here this model sees performance not only as an ultimate outcome of competitive market mechanisms, but also for heritage mechanisms. For example, structures, system, human capital that the organization has inherited over time, but also things like social, political, cultural elements. They're also of importance, and they can also affect the organization's capacities and ultimate performance. But these are things that are not accounted for in personal economics. Personal economics only looks typically at competitive mechanisms. Another example is neo-institutional theory. So neo-institutional theory explains why organizations sometimes explain certain HR practices or other organizational practices, which are sometimes not relevant or not the right thing to do, but why they happen anyway. And they cite three reasons. So coercive, because it's legally mandatory; normative, because people learn it in their training, or because consultancy advises to do that; or mimetic, just because the other organizations are doing it, we aren't doing it. These are three, let's say, non-rational responses in the strict economic sense, and they do not always result in market equilibrium, yet they happen, but they are not accounted for by personal economics. So in sum, personal economics, it's an economic perspective on human resource management. It deals with the internal labor market of firms. So what happens within organizations? How can we organize the employment relationship internally in an efficient and effective way? It assumes that employees and organizations are rational agents, that they act on the basis of information, and they do so in search of maximizing their welfare and often their financial welfare. It also assumes that this welfare of employees and organizations can be mutually satisfied in a way that they are both, of course, content. There are, of course, important limits to personal economics. One is imperfect labor markets. I think you already feel this coming. Real labor markets are not necessarily in equilibrium. If they were in equilibrium, there would be no strikes. Labor markets work very different in reality. The ones of employees and organizations, it's usually very difficult to satisfy them at the same time. Another equilibrium is the interference from political, legal, and cultural contexts that are also important in addition to market factors. These are typical things that cannot be or very difficultly accounted for by personal economics, that we have to look for other perspectives, so more HR perspectives, more organizational perspective, like the contextual HR model, like institutional theory. Okay, so this is the journey we're going to embark on. This is an overview of the course. Today we have a very small introduction course. But the next two courses, we're going to go fully on motivating employees, so the principal-agent problem, and monetary and non-monetary incentives. Then we're going to talk about selecting and recruiting employees, training, and the final two classes, we will focus on competition between employees, for example, for a promotion, and cooperation between employees, so incentivizing employees in a team. I've also listed next to each topic the required materials to these courses, so which study material corresponds to which classes. Note that we only have 7 classes in total, and this is because the 8th course is cancelled. Due to Corona, Block 4 is 1 week shorter. I had planned to do some kind of questions about the assignment and course then, but note that I'm always open for these kind of questions. Okay, the book we're going to use is the book of Kuhn. I've chosen this book because it's very readable. It's actually written with the fact in mind that students actually have to read a handbook, in contrast to like the old zero books, which are very technical. I think it's always written in a more humorous way, but yeah, I know tastes for humor are very much personal. There's different ways of obtaining the book. Despite the situation, you can still order them from Amazon or from Bolt.com if you're in the Netherlands. But I actually suggest to order an ebook. That way you get it straight away. So it's more easier, but it's also more cheaper way to get a book. And you can do that to either Red Shelf or Czech. So I would recommend Czech. I think it's the cheapest and easiest option. But of course, I know students are also very creative in finding alternative ways of obtaining the book. So I think accessing the book should be no issue. This course will be graded on two things, an assignment and a written exam. For the assignment, I want you to look for an article in the quality press or professional literature. What do I mean? I mean, for example, The Guardian, Harvard Business Review, Washington Post, but it can also be something from Telegraaf, Financieel Dagblad. As long as if I can read it in the language I can read it, it's okay for me. And I want you to connect this article with at least 2 issues described in the course. So it actually mean with information from 2 courses. So you try to link it to models, logics, theories, experiments that you have seen in the course. Then based on this article and your analysis, I want you to answer the following 3 questions. So first, give detailed analysis of the situation. So what is happening there? What do we see? What can we deduce from this article based on personal economics? Then I want you to formulate 2 recommendations for HR. So based on your analysis, what could HR improve in this situation? Try, of course, to be founded. Can be based on what you see in the book, can also be based on prior knowledge you have from other courses. And then finally, to what extent do you judge the perspective of personal economics a strength or limitation in analyzing the situation? To answer this question, you might want or need to refer back to the theories I've quickly went over, so the contextual HRM model, institutional theory, but there's also a bit of personal opinion involved. Deadline for this is the 3rd of June. You hand it in via Canvas. This is about 1,000 words, 1 page for 30% of the grade, so I think this is easy grades. And then there is an exam. In order to give as much coherent information about the exam as possible, I've made this an open book exam. So it might be good to order a book or to have some kind of copy physical or electronically available. I think if you do the exam open book, it doesn't matter if the exam is going to be online or physical because you would have access to the material anyway. And the exam is organized like this. So it will be around, let's say, 4, 5, 6 questions, depend a bit on the length or difficulty of the questions. 3 to 4 will be broader questions, and I will ask to focus on similarities and differences between, let's say, experiments, logics, or theories as they feature in the course. For example, what's the difference between the experiment of Gnisi and Lazier? What are the similarities between individual pay and team pay? So these kind of questions that need you to contrast different elements in the course with each other. Then a second type of question will be application. So there will be 1 application question in the exam that we need to answer a bit broadly. And this is comparable to the assignment. So this will be, let's say, an article where you need to deduce some information from, link it to things you know from the course, and probably give some advice or so on. Okay. I also wish to stress there is a lot of math in the book, and don't let this scare you. I stress in this course what is important, and my focus is often on the philosophy behind the math. So what the math and what the graphs are actually trying to tell. I try to limit the math in this course to the minimum for the simple reasons you are not mathematics students and you are not economics students either. So I try to find a balance there. See the slides as a guideline on how to read the book. Of course, if you have questions about this course, assignment, or general things, you can always email me. I don't promise I will always respond to you straight away, but I'll try to respond as soon as possible. I will also host a chat session on this Wednesday during the regular course hours. This is a bit of a test. I want to see if this is manageable. We are in about 19, I saw in Canvas, so this should work. If this is a bit of chaos, then we'll move on to discussion boards. Since it's also the first time I'll be hosting a fully online course. I'm also open to all your suggestions you might have or things we can improve about this kind of format. Would you prefer a live course like sometime, or would you like to see my face, or you have other suggestions? Please feel free to do so via mail. And this being said, I declare it's on. It has started, people. So many thanks for being in this course, and I'm looking forward